There is a testimony in the ancient world that almost no one has read. It was not lost. It was preserved carefully in 4 languages, in the libraries of monasteries across 3 continents. It was quietly kept out of the Bible you were given. And it contains something the book of Genesis does not. It contains Eve's own account of what happened in the garden. Not because Genesis is silent about it, it says plenty. Not because the story is obscure. Every child in the Christian world knows the fruit and the serpent. Not because scholars did not know this other text existed. They have known for 2,000 years. The reason you have not read it is simpler. It was not meant for you to read. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you will look at the story of Eden very differently. First, let us understand what we are actually talking about. The text is called The Life of Adam and Eve. In its Greek version, it is sometimes titled The Apocalypse of Moses. It exists in Latin, Greek, Armenian, Georgian, and Slavonic manuscripts. Some copies date to the 5th century, but the text itself is older, much older. Most scholars place its composition somewhere between the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century after, which means, and this matters, it was circulating in the Jewish and early Christian world at exactly the moment the New Testament was being written. If you find these old, quietly preserved documents fascinating, subscribe. We hunt them down here every week. The document runs for roughly 51 short chapters. It is a deathbed narrative. Adam is dying. He calls Eve and their 30 sons and 30 daughters. The text specifies the number to gather around him. He tells them one final story about what happened in the garden. And then, when Adam has died, Eve gathers the children again. She tells them her story. Eve's version is longer. Eve's version is stranger. Eve's version contains details Genesis does not. That alone should make you pause, because in the Bible you have on your shelf, Eve barely speaks. In Genesis 3, she has 3 lines of dialogue, total. She answers the serpent. She defends herself to God. And then, for the rest of the story of humanity, she is silent. She becomes the mother of Cain and Abel and Seth. She lives to see her son murdered by his brother. She lives, according to Jewish tradition, for 930 years alongside Adam. And in all of that time, in the entire canonical Hebrew Bible, she does not speak again, except in this text. In this text, she speaks for chapters. Where did the text come from? That is a genuinely difficult question. The oldest surviving fragments are Greek, preserved in Byzantine monastery libraries. But the Armenian and Georgian versions preserve details the Greek does not, which tells scholars something crucial. The text was translated from one tradition into another so many times that each language kept a slightly different piece. The Slavonic version, kept for centuries in Russian and Bulgarian monasteries, contains a passage the Greek scribes seem to have quietly removed. The Armenian version, preserved by monks in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, contains a different passage the Latin scribes removed. Piece by piece, the scholars had to reconstruct what the original said. The reconstruction took most of the 20th century. Michael Stone at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem spent decades on the Armenian tradition. Marinus de Jonge at Leiden edited the Greek. James Charlesworth at Princeton included it in his monumental collection of Old Testament Pseudepigrapha in the mid-1980s. Between them, a picture emerged. Not of a single lost book, but of a text that had been carefully, deliberately, chapter by chapter thinned out. The pieces that survived in one language had been cut from another. What one tradition thought was safe, another thought was dangerous. Here is what they agreed on. The original text is old. It predates Christianity, and parts of it were never intended to reach a general audience. Now, before you dismiss that as speculation, as the kind of thing conspiracy authors say about every ancient document, consider what the manuscripts themselves show. The variations between versions are not the ordinary drift of scribes copying with tired eyes. They are systematic. The same specific passages disappear in the same specific traditions. That is not accident, that is editing. And here is the detail that matters. The passages that were removed most often were passages spoken by Eve. So what does she say? She begins the way any old person begins a difficult story, with a setting. She tells her children that God had divided the garden into 2 parts. Adam was to keep watch over one half. She was to keep watch over the other. This is the first detail Genesis does not give us. In the Bible, Eden is one place. In Eve's telling, it is 2. She was, in her own account, alone at her end of the garden when the serpent came. That is one thing, but the second detail is something else entirely. The serpent, she tells her children, did not simply appear and speak. The serpent, according to Eve, was working with someone else. In the Greek life of Adam and Eve, in the passage the scholars call the Apocalypse of Moses, Eve says that Satan spoke to the serpent first. She says the serpent was persuaded. She says the serpent was the vessel, not the mind. This is not a fringe reading. It is what the text says, in every surviving language without exception. But it does not stop there. Eve tells her children that when the serpent came to her, it did not begin with the tree. It began with a question about God. It began, according to the text, by asking her whether she was certain, genuinely certain, of what she had been told about the fruit. The serpent's opening move was not temptation. It was doubt. It was an epistemological question. Do you know what you think you know? Pause on that for a moment. The Genesis version compresses this. In Genesis, the serpent simply asks whether God really said they must not eat from any tree. It is one line. Eve's version, in the Apocalypse of Moses, expands it into an argument that runs for paragraphs. The serpent, she tells her children, made a case. He explained things. He explained specifically what would happen if she ate. And his explanation was not entirely a lie. Two independent manuscript traditions preserve this, the Greek and the Armenian. Neither borrowed from the other. Both agree on the shape of the argument. Both agree on the substance of what the serpent said. And in both, Eve's summary of it, told to her children on her deathbed, is the same. The scribes had no contact. The versions came from different centuries, different empires, different theological environments. And they say the same thing. Now, let us talk about what the scholars did with this, because this is where it becomes genuinely difficult to shrug off. For most of the 20th century, the life of Adam and Eve was treated as a curiosity, a piece of intertestamental literature, interesting for what it showed about Jewish thought in the last centuries before Christ, but not, in itself, a serious historical source about Eden. That was the mainstream view. In the last 30 years, that view has quietly shifted. The reason is the Nag Hammadi discovery. In 1945, in Upper Egypt, a set of 13 leather-bound codices was found buried in a jar at the base of a cliff. Inside were 52 texts. Some were previously unknown. Others were versions of texts scholars had heard of but never seen. And among them were 3 separate documents that retold the story of Eden: the Apocryphon of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, and the Testimony of Truth. Each one gave a version of the fall that differed sharply from Genesis. Each one gave Eve a much larger speaking role. And in each one, elements matched the older life of Adam and Eve tradition, too precisely to be coincidence. The shared elements were not decorative, they were structural. Both traditions describe the garden as divided. Both describe a period of instruction before the fall. Eve is not simply tricked, she is taught. Both describe the fruit as producing not death immediately, but knowledge immediately. Both describe an awakening. Both describe the serpent as one part of a longer chain of events, not the whole cause. And both, and this is the detail that made the scholars stop, describe Eve as receiving something after the fall that she was later forbidden to speak about. The texts do not agree on what she received. They agree that she received something. Gary Anderson at Notre Dame, in a series of papers, laid out the case that these overlaps could not be explained by borrowing. The life of Adam and Eve is older than the Nag Hammadi codices. The Nag Hammadi codices could not have influenced it, but the life of Adam and Eve is preserved only in Christian monastic libraries, and the Nag Hammadi codices were buried in the 4th century, meaning any influence in the other direction would have to run underground, quietly, through channels that did not leave a paper trail. What Anderson and others concluded was less dramatic and more troubling. The two traditions were not borrowing from each other. They were both drawing on something older, something we do not have, a memory or a body of teaching or a set of texts that circulated before either of them and left fingerprints on both. That earlier something is what scholars have started calling, cautiously, the primary Eden tradition. And Eve is at the center of it. Here is where it gets genuinely strange. The primary tradition preserves Eve not as the woman who was tricked. It preserves her as the woman who was taught first, who understood first, and who, according to her own testimony at the end of her life, spent the rest of her 900 years trying to work out what had happened to her, trying, in her own words, to remember. Now, what did she remember? The life of Adam and Eve gives us 4 things. Each one, on its own, could be read as poetic language, or as a symbol, or as a scribe's flourish. All 4 together are harder to explain. The first is the light. Eve tells her children that when she ate the fruit, she saw. Not metaphorically, she saw. Her exact words in the Greek, as best the scholars can reconstruct them, describe the leaves of every tree shedding at that moment, as if the garden itself had been clothed in something and had suddenly gone bare. She says she saw her nakedness for the first time, but she does not say she was ashamed first. She says she was awake first. Shame came second. That is not the Genesis order. In Genesis, awareness and shame are the same instant, but it goes further. The second thing she remembers is Adam's reaction. In Genesis, Adam eats, becomes aware, and hides. In Eve's testimony, Adam does something else first. He speaks to her. He asks her with real fear what she has done. And her answer, preserved in every version we have, is not a confession. It is a description. She tells Adam what she saw. She tells him about the light. She tells him about the leaves. And then, this is the sentence, she tells him she is giving it to him so that he will know what she now knows. That is a different story. That is not a woman handing over poison. That is a woman handing over sight. The third thing she remembers is the voice. She tells her children that after they both ate, And after the garden went silent, they heard something. Genesis calls it the sound of the Lord God walking. Eve's testimony calls it something else. It calls it a voice sounding like a trumpet, summoning the angels. Multiple angels. She lists them by name in some versions, and the names are names that do not appear anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Uriel, Sariel, and others. Pause on that for a moment. The Hebrew Bible does not name angels except Michael and Gabriel, and only very rarely. In Eve's account, at the moment of the fall, an entire host of angels arrives, with names, with tasks, with a hierarchy. She remembers the names 900 years later. Now we come to the detail that, perhaps more than any other, makes this text impossible to easily categorize. The fourth thing is what she says she was shown afterwards. Not before the fall, afterwards. The text describes Eve after her expulsion, receiving a series of visions. The Armenian version is the most explicit. She sees the future. She sees her son Cain kill her son Abel before it happens. She sees the flood before it happens. She sees, according to some readings, further events beyond that too. And she is told, specifically, not to say what she has seen. She is told to write it down and give it to Seth. And Seth, according to the Testament, is to keep it hidden. The text says Eve did this. The text says the tablets Seth received are still somewhere hidden. The most extraordinary claim in Eve's testimony is not any of the four details I have just described. The most extraordinary claim is what she tells her children the fall was actually for. Here is where intellectual honesty matters more than dramatic storytelling. The text is not fully consistent. Different versions emphasize different things, but across every surviving language, one line, or a variation of one line, appears at the end of Eve's speech to her children. It is spoken by Eve. It is preserved in the Greek, the Armenian, the Georgian, and the Slavonic. And it is preserved without gloss, without commentary, without softening. She tells her children that what she did so that they would know. Now, before you read that as maternal defense, as the natural rationalization of a woman looking back on a catastrophe from 900 years of distance, consider the shape of the surrounding text. The line is not offered as an excuse. It is offered as an instruction. She is not defending the fall. She is passing something on. She is telling her children on her deathbed that what she did was for them, and she's telling them that what they now know, being human, knowing shame, knowing death, knowing choice, is what she gave them, deliberately. Some scholars read this as a piece of Jewish protest literature, an attempt in the last centuries before Christ to rewrite the meaning of the fall from tragedy into inheritance. Others read it as the residue of an older tradition, one in which Eve was not a villain and not a victim, but a teacher who chose, a teacher who paid for it. The monks who preserved this text through the Middle Ages did not tell us which reading is correct. In some monasteries, the passage is preserved in full. In others, it is quietly cut. The scholars themselves acknowledge they do not fully understand what the original tradition believed. But the line survives in every language. And Eve, in her own testimony, says it out loud. What did she really see when she ate? What did she really pass to her children? The text does not tell us. She names the light, she names the voice, she names the angels. And then, at the moment where she might have said what she actually learned, she stops. The text says, not yet. Now, every one of these elements can be dismissed individually. The manuscript variations can be explained by scribal drift over 1,500 years. The overlaps with the Nag Hammadi codices can be explained by shared cultural background, rather than a common source. The named angels can be explained by later apocalyptic literature bleeding backwards into the text. The line about giving sight can be explained as a first-century pious reflection projected onto Eve's mouth. Any single element has a conventional explanation, but all of them together, preserved across 4 languages, across 3 continents, across 1,500 years of hostile theological climate, converging on the same Eve, the same speech, the same deathbed, the same instruction to her children, that is a different kind of question. The life of Adam and Eve is not yet fully critically edited across all of its versions. The scholarly consensus on what the original said is still, honestly, being worked out. Michael Stone continued publishing on the Armenian tradition into his last years. New fragments in Georgian have surfaced in the last decade that scholars are still integrating. This is a live text. It is not a settled document. What Eve said at the end of her life, according to the tradition, is still being reconstructed. And what she meant is still being argued about. Now step back and look at the full picture. We have a text older than the Gospels, preserved in 4 languages, cut in different places by different traditions, so that no one language holds the whole, independently echoed by texts buried in an Egyptian jar for 1,600 years, so that we can be reasonably sure it did not travel there by borrowing. Placing at its center a woman who, in the Bible we grew up with, was almost entirely silent, and giving her, at the end of her life, a speech that reframes the founding story of the Western religious imagination. She says she was not tricked. She says she was taught. She says the serpent worked for someone else. She says the fall was not the beginning of the tragedy. It was the beginning of the knowing. She says she gave the fruit to Adam not to ruin him, but to bring him with her. And she says she was shown things afterwards that she wrote down and hid. The Bible does not mention any of this. The Bible does not mention the tablets. The Bible does not mention the visions. The Bible does not mention the light. The Bible does not mention that Eve had anything more to say. And here is what is genuinely difficult to accept about all of this. The reason we do not know it is not that it was ever truly lost. It was preserved, carefully, by people who thought it was too important to destroy and too dangerous to distribute. The reason we do not know it is that at some point someone decided the version we would receive would be the short one. What we are left with, after 2,000 years, is not a mystery of information. It is a mystery of attention. Eve's testimony was there the whole time. It was in the monastery libraries. It was in the Armenian and Georgian scriptoria. It was on the shelves the whole time we were not looking. And she was speaking. She was speaking for chapters. We just were not listening. If you found this interesting, subscribe. We track these preserved but hidden texts here every week, the ones the church kept in the library and out of the pulpit. There are more like this, many more. Tell me in the comments which piece of Eve's testimony surprised you most. Was it the divided garden? The two-part deception with Satan behind the serpent? The line about giving the fruit to Adam so he would know what she knew? Or was it the tablets? The ones she said she wrote and hid that the tradition says are still somewhere waiting? Next week, we are going to look at another figure the canonical Bible almost entirely erased. There was, according to two separate ancient traditions, a first wife of Adam. She is not Eve. She left the garden before Eve arrived. And what the old texts say about her is, in some ways, even stranger than what Eve said before she died. I'll see you in the next one.